Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, the soft hum of orchestral music filling the space, the clink of crystal glasses, and low murmurs of old money deals, blending into a symphony of power. His gaze shifted across the polished marble floor to where his mother, Lena Reed, stood in quiet dignity, her hands gently clasped, her eyes filled with pride. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. The Reed family, once marked by poverty, defined by struggle, was on the cusp of sealing a $900 million partnership with the Whitmores, a dynasty of wealth that had ruled over boardrooms and country clubs for generations. But beneath the glitter of chandeliers and designer gowns, a storm was brewing. It began with a whisper, a careless smirk, a glance too long at the plainness of Lena's dress, at the way her silver hair was pinned back with a modest brooch that had once belonged to her mother, a woman born into bondage. Carter Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore fortune, raised his glass, his voice cutting through the music. A joke at Lena's expense, masked as wit. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but sharp enough to slice through Marcus's composure. His mother's eyes met his across the room, eyes that spoke of hurt buried under layers of resilience, eyes that asked him not to make a scene, not to risk everything they had worked for. But Marcus felt the weight of the moment press down on him. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with expectation. Would he smile, shake it off, sign the contract, and secure the future that so many had told him was worth any price? Or would he honor the woman who had given him everything, even if it meant walking away from it all? Every detail of the night had been calculated, every moment choreographed by the Whitmores to display their power. The towering ice sculpture of their family crest, the gold-threaded linens, the waitstaff in crisp uniforms chosen to blend into the background. It was all meant to remind guests who ruled this world. Marcus had known this, accepted it as the cost of admission. But now, that cost was no longer abstract. It was his mother's dignity, auctioned off for a cheap laugh. He recalled the early days, when Lena worked double shifts, when she mended his clothes by hand, when she taught him that integrity mattered more than approval. That brooch she wore tonight, it wasn't just an ornament. It was a symbol of survival, of history, of the quiet strength passed down through generations of women who had endured more than the Whitmores could imagine. The Whitmores saw it as quaint, outdated. But to Marcus, it was priceless. The contract waiting upstairs represented everything he thought he wanted. Market expansion, legacy, validation in the eyes of those who once doubted him. But Carter's smirk had turned that paper into something else, a test of whether he truly believed the lessons his mother taught him. His heart pounded as he weighed the options, the music and laughter fading into a dull roar in his ears. Around him, faces smiled, oblivious or complicit. A senator shook hands with a tech billionaire near the bar. A fashion icon admired herself in a mirror, unaware of the drama unfolding in silence. The world spun on, indifferent. But inside Marcus, something shifted. This wasn't about a deal anymore. It wasn't even about Carter Whitmore's insult. It was about a line that could not be crossed, not without losing himself. He thought of other moments like this in history. The lunch counters where young men and women refused to move. The bus seats claimed by those told they didn't belong. The boardrooms where others had been forced to swallow pride to survive. He thought of what might happen if, for once, someone in his position said no. If someone valued their mother's honor above Wall Street's applause. Marcus knew the headlines that would follow if he walked away. The whispers about him being too emotional, unprofessional, difficult. He knew investors would call, some would withdraw, some would secretly applaud, but never say so out loud. But he also knew the look in his mother's eyes, after seeing him compromise himself, would haunt him longer than any lost deal. This wasn't the first time the Whitmores had tested a man like him, and it wouldn't be the last. But tonight, they had miscalculated. They thought their wealth could buy silence. They thought a contract could outweigh conscience. They thought Marcus Reed was like every other CEO who had come seeking their approval. They were wrong. The question that hung in the air, heavier than any chandelier, was simple. What is the price of dignity, and would Marcus Reed be the man to prove that some things are not for sale? The ballroom's air seemed to thicken as the moment lingered. Carter Whitmore's smirk had already begun to fade, replaced by a casual indifference. As if what he'd said about Lena Reed had been nothing at all, just a joke, just a harmless barb among the powerful. But for Marcus, it echoed louder than the music, louder than the applause that followed Carter's toast. His eyes fixed on Carter, watching him bask in his own cleverness, as if humiliating someone like Lena was a rite of passage in this marble palace of inherited wealth. Lena shifted uncomfortably where she stood. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. She wouldn't give Carter Whitmore or anyone else in that room the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. But Marcus saw it, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she folded them tighter, the way her gaze dropped to the floor for just a second before lifting again with practiced grace. She had endured much worse in her lifetime, and yet this moment stung because it came in the house of supposed allies, at the hands of those they were about to call partners. Marcus made his way across the room, each step deliberate, each breath controlled. The chatter and laughter that had filled the space seemed to dull as he moved, as if the room itself sensed the shift. When he reached Carter, he paused, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, close enough that the weight of his words would land where they needed to. "Carter," Marcus said, his tone calm but unyielding. "Do you think that was funny?" Carter turned, caught off guard by Marcus's directness. He gave a chuckle, the kind that sought to diffuse tension without acknowledging its cause. "Come on, Marcus, don't be so sensitive. We're all friends here." Marcus didn't smile. His eyes didn't waver. "We're not friends, and I want to hear it from you." "Was it funny?" Carter shifted, suddenly aware that the easy charm he wielded so carelessly had failed him. Around them, conversations faltered. People sensed the confrontation blooming and pretended not to notice, though every ear was now tuned to the exchange. It was a harmless joke. Carter said at last, his voice quieter, "Let's not make this into something it's not." Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough that the words felt heavier. "It's exactly what it is. You embarrassed my mother in a room full of strangers to make yourself feel bigger. And I want you to say whether you think that was funny." For the first time, Carter looked away. He sipped his drink, searching for composure he didn't have. "This is business. Marcus, don't let personal feelings ruin what we're building." Marcus's jaw tightened. He thought of every night his mother stayed up sewing clothes for him when they couldn't afford new ones. He thought of every insult she'd swallowed so he could walk through doors like this. And now, with everything on the line, Carter was asking him to swallow this one, too. Across the room, Lena watched, her heart pounding, torn between pride and fear for what might come next. She had raised Marcus to be strong, to stand tall, but she knew the cost of defiance in places like this. Marcus straightened, his voice clear. "What we're building, Carter, what you're building is a house on rot, and I won't be part of it." Carter's smile vanished completely. "You're overreacting," he said, his tone turning sharper. "Think about what you're throwing away." "I am thinking," Marcus replied. "I've thought about it my whole life." The tension cracked through the room like a thunderclap, though no one dared interrupt. A few tried to pretend interest in their drinks, in the art on the walls, but their attention was fixed on Marcus, on Carter, on the unspoken rules of this world being broken before their eyes. Marcus turned from Carter, Without waiting for another word, he crossed back to his mother, offering his arm. She took it, her fingers trembling, not from weakness but from the enormity of what he had just done. Together. They walked out of the ballroom, the echo of their steps louder than any applause they could have received. Behind them, Carter stood frozen, the weight of the moment dawning on him too late. Around him, allies hesitated, unsure whether to comfort him or distance themselves. The empire he represented had been challenged, not by a rival billionaire, but by a man who valued dignity more than wealth. Upstairs, the contract lay waiting, the ink still fresh, the terms generous, the future certain. But as Marcus and Lena stepped into the night air, the cool breeze against their skin felt like freedom. Marcus breathed deeply, the knot in his chest finally loosening. They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of the party fading behind them. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You didn't have to do that, baby." Marcus looked at her, his expression gentle but firm. "Yes, Mama. I did. If I signed that deal after what happened in there, I wouldn't be your son." She smiled then, a small, quiet smile that spoke of 1,000 sacrifices, finally honored. The silver brooch on her shoulder glinted in the moonlight, no longer a target of mockery, but a badge of resilience that no amount of money could buy. And as they walked on, the world behind them began to shift. Word would spread, questions would be asked. Some would condemn Marcus for what they'd call pride. Others would quietly admire the courage it took to say no. But one thing was certain: the rules had changed that night, and Marcus Reed had drawn the line. Morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Reed's penthouse, casting long shadows on the polished hardwood floors. He stood alone, overlooking the city skyline, where glass towers reached for the sky, symbols of ambition, power, and the deals that built empires. But in this quiet hour, none of that mattered. The papers that could have made him the richest black CEO in the country lay untouched on the table behind him. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from board members, investors, advisors. He ignored them all. The decision had been made the moment he saw the flicker of pain in his mother's eyes. There was no contract, no dollar amount. That could erase that. But now, as the world woke to headlines of his exit from the Whitmore deal, the cost of that decision was coming into focus. The markets had reacted. Shares in his company had dipped. Analysts speculated. Was this a power move? A breakdown? Was Marcus Reed a visionary or a man undone by emotion? He didn't care what they thought. Not anymore. The night before, standing across from Carter Whitmore, Marcus had seen something shift. The mask of entitlement that Carter wore so easily had cracked. If only for a moment, the smirk had vanished. The certainty that money could buy silence, that position could erase wrongdoing, had faltered. And in that moment, Marcus realized the real power in the room hadn't belonged to Carter. It had belonged to the one person willing to walk away. By noon, Carter had called twice. The first time, Marcus let it ring. The second time, he answered, his voice measured, calm. "Carter," he said, offering no warmth. "Marcus," Carter began, the usual arrogance replaced by something less steady. "Let's talk about this. Last night got out of hand. Emotions were high. We shouldn't let it ruin everything we've built." Marcus stared out at the city, his grip on the phone tightening. "Everything we've built," he echoed. "Carter, you and I didn't build anything. I built my company from the ground up. You were buying your way in. Let's not pretend it was something else." There was silence on the other end. Then Carter tried again. "Look, I get it. What I said, what happened, it was out of line. But be reasonable, this is business. We're talking about $900 million. You're going to throw that away because of one bad joke? Marcus's laugh was low, humorless. You still don't get it. It wasn't a joke, it was a glimpse of who you are. And I'm done pretending I don't see it. The call ended, not with shouting, but with the quiet finality that comes when one man realizes he has no leverage left. News spread fast. Media outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail. Some framed Marcus as principled. Others painted him as impulsive, letting pride overshadow profit. But beyond the headlines, something deeper was happening. CEOs of color, long accustomed to swallowing their pride in rooms like that ballroom, began to speak out. Anonymous op-eds appeared. Old stories resurfaced, moments of humiliation endured in silence to close deals, to keep seats at tables where they were never truly welcomed. The phone calls Marcus received now weren't from investors demanding answers. They were from men and women thanking him, from people he'd never met who saw in his decision the courage they'd long wished to summon. And from a few allies within the Whitmore circle, those too fearful to stand up publicly, came quiet messages of respect. Admissions that Carter's behavior had shamed them, too. But Carter wasn't done. In desperation, he arranged a meeting, hoping to salvage what was left. Marcus agreed. Not for the deal, but for the clarity it would bring. They met in a private lounge atop one of the Whitmore buildings, the kind of place designed to impress, with leather chairs, rare art, and views that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Carter entered first, dressed sharp as ever, but his confidence was brittle now. Marcus arrived minutes later, calm, controlled. They sat opposite each other, the city sprawling beneath them, as silent witnesses. Carter began, his tone more measured than before. Marcus, I'm not here to argue, I'm here to make this right. What do you want an apology, public or private? You want me to donate to one of your causes? I'll do it. Name the price. Marcus studied him, eyes steady. That's the problem. Carter, you think everything has a price. But what I want, you can't give. What I want is for my mother to never have been humiliated. What I want is for people like her to be treated with respect, without men like you needing to be shamed into it. What I want is for you to understand why what you did matters. But that's not something I can buy from you, and it's not something you can offer. Carter's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. No, Carter, Marcus said quietly. I made the mistake the moment I thought partnering with you would change the world. It won't. But maybe saying no will. The meeting ended like the call had, with no shouting, no threats. Just the quiet certainty that the balance of power had shifted. Not in boardrooms or on spreadsheets, but in the minds of those who saw that courage could redraw the lines of what was acceptable. As Marcus left the building, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting the city in gold. He knew the cost of his choice. He knew there would be fallout. But he also knew that some moments define more than a career, they define a legacy. And Marcus Reed had chosen his. The story should have ended with a canceled deal. That's what Carter Whitmore believed, what his family believed, what the press believed in those first few days. But it didn't. What Marcus Reed set in motion reached far beyond a broken contract. It reached into boardrooms where people like him had long sat quietly, hoping not to draw attention to the daily indignities that came with success in spaces never meant for them. It reached into the hearts of entrepreneurs, of workers, of students watching from the sidelines, wondering what price they might one day pay for dignity. Marcus hadn't planned to start a movement. That wasn't his goal. He wasn't interested in speeches or protests. But when the headlines hit, when the video of him and Lena leaving that ballroom went viral, when the clip of him standing across from Carter spread across feeds and screens, something shifted. People weren't just watching the collapse of a deal, they were watching a man draw a line that others had been too tired or too afraid to draw. Within days, the calls and messages changed. They weren't from the usual corporate voices, not from the investors urging him to reconsider, or the journalists asking for comment. They came from people he didn't know. Black founders shut out of funding rounds because they didn't fit the culture. Young professionals who had been told to change their names on resumes to sound more mainstream. Employees of giant firms who'd sat through mandatory diversity trainings only to return to offices where nothing changed. And Marcus listened. He began meeting quietly with other CEOs, men and women who had once been praised for breaking barriers, but had been forced to build entire careers on swallowing their pride. They shared stories that mirrored his own, a backhanded comment at a fundraiser, a joke that wasn't a joke at a client dinner, a promotion delayed because they were seen as not a fit for the next level of leadership. The Whitmore incident wasn't unique, it was just public. The deeper Marcus looked, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't about Carter Whitmore. It wasn't about one bad night or one bad man. The problem was systemic, a culture of power that believed itself untouchable, that thought it could dress its biases in fine suits and polite smiles, a culture that demanded black excellence but punished black pride. Meanwhile, the Whitmores tried to control the damage. Carter disappeared from public view. The family's PR machine pushed out statements of regret, donations to causes they'd never cared about before, promises of change that rang hollow. But it wasn't enough. Investors began asking questions, not just about the deal with Marcus, but about the values of the family behind their fortunes. Other deals stalled. Partners pulled back. For the first time, the Whitmore name, once synonymous with prestige, carried a stain. But Marcus didn't stop at rejecting them. He saw a chance to do something greater. With the calls, the letters, the stories flooding in, he began laying the groundwork for something new, a fund dedicated not just to helping black entrepreneurs get a seat at the table, but to building new tables entirely. He called it the Line Initiative, named for the invisible line he'd drawn that night, the line between compromise and conviction. His board had questions, of course. Was this the best use of his time? Was he risking the company's future by focusing so publicly on what some called divisive issues? But Marcus held firm. He told them, "If we don't stand for something now, we'll have nothing worth standing on later." Other leaders began to step forward. A prominent black female CEO came out in support of the Line Initiative, sharing for the first time how she'd been passed over for key deals after refusing to play along with demeaning rituals of acceptance. A Latino tech founder joined, donating part of his fortune to the fund. Even a few white executives quietly aligned themselves. Men and women tired of watching good people forced to choose between success and self-respect. What Marcus understood, and what so many began to see, was that the Whitmores weren't the exception. They were the rule that needed to be rewritten. The problem wasn't one family or one deal gone wrong. It was a system that rewarded silence and punished those who dared to expect decency. And so, what started as a confrontation in a ballroom grew into something larger, a conversation that could no longer be avoided. A reckoning not just with Carter Whitmore's cruelty, but with an entire culture's complacency. The story appeared on major networks, in business journals, on podcasts dissecting what it meant for the future of corporate America. And through it all, Marcus refused to let the narrative be twisted. "This isn't about revenge," he said in one interview. "It's about respect. About making sure the next black entrepreneur doesn't have to choose between a deal and his dignity." The Whitmores tried to stage their comeback. Carter released a video apology, carefully scripted, framed by symbols of humility, a plain office, no suit, no tie. But the public didn't buy it. The damage had been done, not by what he said in that video, but by what he revealed that night, when he thought no one important would care. in private. Carter raged at how quickly the tides had turned. He blamed Marcus. He blamed social media. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had thought his wealth could protect him from consequences. Marcus had shown him otherwise. And beyond that single officer of power, beyond that single family, beyond that single room, the rules were changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Because one man said no, Marcus Reed didn't set out to become a symbol. But symbols aren't chosen. They are made in moments when doing what's right costs more than anyone is willing to pay. And Marcus had paid it, in full view of a watching world. Now came the harder part, turning that moment into a movement, turning principle into policy, and showing that accountability wasn't a headline, it was a practice. In the weeks after walking away from the Whitmore deal, Marcus launched the Line Initiative publicly. He stood on a stage in front of a room filled, not with the usual faces from elite business circles, but with young founders, community leaders, educators, and workers who rarely got invitations to such events. The venue wasn't a hotel ballroom or private club. It was a university auditorium in the heart of the city where he grew up. No chandeliers, no catered meals, just folding chairs, microphones, and an audience that came to hear not promises, but a plan. The speech wasn't long. Marcus didn't believe in dressing up truth. He told them how he'd built his company, how deals like the one with the Whitmores were supposed to mean arrival. How? In rooms like that ballroom, respect was too often a condition of surrender. And how he had decided publicly, clearly, without apology, that dignity wasn't for sale. The Line Initiative isn't about charity, he said. It's about investment. We're not asking for a seat at their table. We're building new tables. Tables where respect isn't a gift, it's the standard. The room erupted in applause, but Marcus didn't smile. He knew applause was easy. Action was harder. The Line Initiative moved quickly. It pledged funding for Black and minority-owned startups, mentorship for first-generation founders, partnerships with universities to train young entrepreneurs. But it wasn't just about money. Marcus made sure every company that took investment from the line signed on to a code, no tolerance for bigotry, inside or out, transparency in hiring, in pay, in promotion, real consequences for failure. Boardrooms took notice. Some tried to dismiss it as a stunt. Others scrambled to issue their own statements of solidarity, to launch programs they hoped would quiet criticism. But the public had seen the difference. They saw who acted and who reacted. The Whitmores, meanwhile, struggled to regain their footing. Donations to civil rights causes fell flat, seen as too little, too late. Corporate partners distanced themselves. Carter's apology tour carefully staged interviews. Charity appearances failed to erase the image of the man who had thought respect could be bought with a check and a handshake. One of the most striking shifts came quietly. A group of major investors announced they were forming a task force to review the companies in their portfolios for cultural integrity, an idea inspired directly by Marcus's stand. They admitted what few had dared to say aloud, that racism, even in its quietest forms, was a business risk. Marcus kept working. He didn't give long interviews. He didn't posture. Instead, he focused on the deals, on the grants, on the people. He visited schools. He met with young founders who had once thought success required assimilation. He sat with them and listened, not as a mogul dispensing wisdom from on high, but as a man who had once stood where they stood. The accountability he demanded wasn't just external. Marcus turned the same mirror on his own company. He opened up hiring and promotion data. He invited staff to call out failures. He made sure the Line Initiative wasn't a brand, it was a promise, tested every day. And through it all, Lena Reed stood by quietly, proud but private. She came to the first Line event, wearing the same silver brooch, a silent reminder of the night everything changed. Reporters tried to interview her. She declined. This wasn't her moment, she said, but everyone who saw her knew better. The line existed because of her, because of the line she'd helped her son see, and the courage he found to draw it. Eventually, even some within the old power circles began to change. Not all, not many, but some. A rival CEO, long silent on matters of race, publicly endorsed the line code and adopted it in his firm. A major bank announced it would tie executive bonuses to diversity benchmarks, citing the need for more than words. Carter Whitmore watched from the sidelines. His influence diminished. His offers rejected. He made calls. Few returned them. He issued statements. Few believed them. The empire he'd inherited remained, but the unchecked power he'd wielded so carelessly was gone. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He understood that real victory wasn't about seeing Carter fall. It was about seeing others rise, unburdened by the same old rules. The final proof came not in headlines, but in moments that no camera captured. The young founder who told Marcus she'd walked out of a meeting when an investor crossed the line, and found another investor the next day who respected her. The high school student who decided to apply to business school, believing for the first time that there was a place for her at the table. The employee who spoke up in a meeting, knowing she wouldn't be punished for defending her dignity. Building accountability wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. But it was happening. And Marcus Reed knew this. The line he drew that night in the ballroom wasn't a finish line. It was a starting point. Carter Whitmore sat alone in his office, the city sprawling beyond the glass like a kingdom he no longer ruled. The power that once felt absolute now seemed hollow. Every deal tinged with suspicion, every handshake a reminder of what he'd lost. He replayed that night over and over, the careless joke, the smirk he thought harmless, the moment Marcus Reed's eyes met his and saw straight through him. He had thought wealth meant invincibility. He had thought lineage meant immunity. But no amount of money could erase the truth of who he'd been in that moment, or the damage it had done. The world had moved on, but the stain remained. The Whitmore name still opened doors, but no longer without question. Partners asked hard questions now. Reporters dug deeper. Boardrooms whispered. And Carter felt it every day, the cost of a moment's cruelty, the price of arrogance. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed stood on a very different stage. The Line Initiative had grown beyond his imagination. What began as a pledge became a network, a standard, a movement. His face was on magazine covers. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered were the lives changed, the businesses launched, the careers built, the young people who saw in him a map for how to walk through the world without leaving their integrity at the door. Justice. Marcus understood, wasn't about Carter Whitmore falling. It was about others rising. It was about making sure that what happened in that ballroom wasn't just called out, but never repeated, in private moments. Marcus still thought of that night, not with regret, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He remembered the weight of his mother's hand on his arm as they walked out together, the sound of their footsteps, the silence that followed, the cool night air that felt like freedom. He thought of the line he drew, not against one man, but against a way of doing business that had gone unchallenged for too long. And Carter, in his quieter hours, in the spaces between meetings and memos, he saw it too. He saw the man he'd been, the man who chose a cheap laugh over decency. He told himself it had been a mistake, a slip, a joke gone wrong. But deep down, he knew better. It had been a reveal, and now there was no taking it back. Sometimes he wondered what might have been, if he'd paused, if he'd treated Lena Reed with the respect she deserved, if he'd seen Marcus as a partner, not a player to be put in his place. But those were questions without answers. The past didn't change. Only the future could. Marcus never sought an apology, and none ever came. But he didn't need one. Justice wasn't about forcing contrition. It was about drawing the line so clearly that no one dared cross it again. It was about changing what was acceptable, what was normal, what was possible. He ended speeches with the same reminder. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. About the world we're building together. A world where dignity isn't negotiated. A world where respect is the baseline, not the prize. And for every person who heard those words, who took them to heart, who acted on them, the arc of justice bent a little closer toward what it was meant to be.